Well, we're almost through Daniel. I realize that we're only on chapter 4, but talking about discipleship lessons, we're not going to be moving into the prophecy. As we think about Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar today, chapters 4s and 5s, both were Babylonian kings who fought the same enemy, pride. Nebuchadnezzar saw the power of God when he saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego delivered from that fiery furnace. But that didn't stop his pride. Belshazzar heard stories about Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, but that didn't stop his pride either. Today we'll see how God used a dream about a magnificent tree and a vision about handwriting on the wall to bring about repentance or judgment, all because of pride. In chapter 4, as it starts, our first discipleship lesson is God can save the most wicked. In verses 1 through 3, Nebuchadnezzar starts writing the chapter. This is the only book, the only chapter in the entire Bible that is written by a Gentile king. And it's the personal testimony and the decree of what's happened to him. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth at that time, had just recovered from his 7-year period of insanity, as we'll discover, and how he'd been punished by God for his sin of pride. And now he wants to proclaim to the world the one to whom all the glory and power and honor belong. And that is not himself, as he had thought earlier, but it is the one true living God. And he starts with peace be multiplied. What a strange way for a man with this history to start out. The man who sent people to the fiery furnace, the man who conquered and plundered and destroyed Jerusalem. And not only that, many other nations around the world. He says, I want you to know God's peace, the peace that can only come from a relationship with him. For that to happen, something radical must have taken place in the life of this king. And here it is. It all starts with a dream. Our next lesson is pride is an unseen enemy. Those of us who have it, those of us who have battled it, those of us who may have it in the future, we don't recognize it, but it's there. Nebuchadnezzar was at ease. His life was going great. He had everything he needed. He had power, he had political peace, and he had prosperity. There was nothing wrong. But all of these had been given to him as a gift from God. And the problem starts when the gift takes the place of God. And so he receives a dream that changes everything. And faced with this terrifying dream, he first goes to all of the astrologers, all of the soothsayers, all of the Chaldean wise men as he had before. But just like before, there is absolutely no help. He did not want to go to Daniel again, because to do that, he would have to acknowledge that the God of Daniel, the God of Israel, was greater than any of the gods he served. But finally, he's called. And at last, Daniel came before me, and his name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. But in him, in Daniel, is the spirit of the holy God. And I told my dream before him. And he said, I'm telling you this because the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you. Explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. And so in verses 10 through 14 of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar tells the dream. He tells Daniel that he saw this magnificent tree. And underneath this tree that had grown so tall it could be seen from anywhere on earth, the birds would make their nests. The beast would come and they'd find shade, and everything was wonderful. Until, in verse 15 through 17, a voice comes from heaven. And it says, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, scatter its fruits, and let the beast and the birds flee from it. But the tree would not be destroyed completely. The stump would be left in the midst of all the new grown grass and a band of iron around it. Then what the king saw and heard moved from talking about this tree to talking about a man. And it says, let him, that which was cut down, live among the beast and graze among the animals on the earth. His heart will be changed from that of a human to that of a beast, and 7 times will pass over him. It says, this decision is in order that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of earth and gives to it whomever he will and sets over it the lowest of men. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't figure that one out. Neither could any of the wise men. So they called in Daniel. And when Daniel hears it, he's troubled. Not because he can't figure it out, but because the meaning of it. And he learns, or exhibits rather, the next discipleship lesson, and that's to speak the truth in love. He could have come against the king really hard because he knew what his life had been like, and he knew that Nebuchadnezzar deserved this dream. But he said, oh, king, I wish that this dream were for your enemies and not for you. May we be like Daniel. When we have to speak words of judgment, words that are hard, may we do it with a heart of love and with compassion. And Nebuchadnezzar was there, and he said, I declare to me its interpretation, since all the wise men and the ungodly are not able to do so. But you are able to do it because the Spirit of God is in you. Do you realize that the ungodly, the unrighteous, expect you, if you are a Bible-believing person, to be able to tell them what God is saying for the time? What God's message is to them, how they can live God's life, what God means to them. And so Daniel did. He told Nebuchadnezzar that, said, King, the tree represents you. And the angel is calling for that tree to be cut. And this has been decided as a divine decree. And you would be cut down, and you're going to be tormented with the mind of a beast, and you're going to live out in the field and eat the grass just like an ox does. And it's going to last for 7 years. And during that time, you're going to be cast out of the palace, and no one is going to listen to you. And just like that tree, your kingdom is going to be taken away. But there is an element of hope. You see, the kingdom will be restored to you when and if you acknowledge that God is the one true and living God. And in verse 27, therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. He says, if you do this, he said, let me show you what God's mercy can do. If you will repent of your sin of pride, if you will turn from your evil ways, God can have mercy on you, just like he has done so many other times. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar thought about it. And he decided, that sounds like a good idea to me. But our next life lesson is God's word is true, even if there is a delay. You see, it took 12 months for Nebuchadnezzar to come back to his old self. 12 months for him to get complacent with God. And one day, as he's walking about on the roof of his palace, he starts looking over Babylon, looking over everything that he has, thinking about all of his accomplishments, and thinking, oh, I need to give honor and praise to the one that's done this all. Me. That's it. I did it all. And he thinks, look at this magnificent city that I have built. See how great I am. And while he was in the midst of praising himself, a voice was heard from heaven and said, Nebuchadnezzar, you have lost the kingdom. And in verse 33, that very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird claws. He was forced to leave the palace, just as Daniel had said, and he lived with the wild animals. Here is one who had ruled people, nations, and kingdoms, and now he can't even control himself. Nebuchadnezzar lived this way for 7 years. But God's purpose was not to humiliate him. God loved Nebuchadnezzar. And we might find that hard to believe, but despite Nebuchadnezzar's ego, despite the way he treated people, throwing them into the fire, bringing them captive from Jerusalem, destroying the city. Everything he did was evil. But God loved him. And he wanted to see him changed. And he gave him that opportunity to change. And so, verse 34 says, at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom from generation to generation. You know what? The next time you regret your past, the next time you feel really bad about what you've done, and you start thinking, oh, there's no hope for me. There's no way I'll ever get out of this. There's no way that God could ever get me out of this situation. Think about Nebuchadnezzar. His testimony is, you can go as low as you can go. And God is still able to lift you out of that pit. He's able to give you a new life. He's able to give you a new heart. He's able to give you a new beginning. Everything you need, all you have to do is just recognize him and proclaim him for who he is. That's all you have to do. Everything had been stripped away from Nebuchadnezzar. Everything but God. And in the depths of his suffering, he raised his eyes to heaven, and there he proclaimed, God is the Most High God. And in that very moment, his sanity is restored. And Nebuchadnezzar declares that the God of the Hebrews alone has everlasting dominion. He affirms the sovereignty of God over all creation. And after this, God again made him king of Babylon and restored everything that had been lost to him. And his testimony that he started way back in the beginning of this chapter was continued. He says, I praise the God, the King of heavens. I know God is a ruler. He humbles proud people, and he gives kingdoms to ever whom he chooses to give them to. He said, it's not about you and your little kingdom. It's all about God. Well, chapter 4 ends on such a high note. I tell you what, we've got the king of the world at that time praising God. But time passes. We enter chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar's no longer around. And his grandson is, though. And because of pride, Daniel chapter 5 is about the destruction of the greatest worldwide kingdom at that time, the Babylonian Empire. And our first lesson for this is God's going to go just so far. Chapter 5 opens with a new king, Belshazzar. He is recognized by history as being the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. But the humility and faith that his grandfather had certainly did not get passed on to him. It's been said that God has no grandsons, and that statement was certainly true with Belshazzar. One day he threw this grand party, and he invited 1,000 nobles and officials to come and eat. And he called his attendants and says, "Oh, you know those golden and silver goblets that we got from that temple there in Jerusalem? Why don't you bring it to me? Because we're going to worship our God of gold and silver, and we'll show them just how strong our God is." So he and his guests were drinking from the goblets. You see, to him, life was a party. They had it all. They had everything they could want. Live for today was Babylon's motto of the day. But 1 Corinthians 15:22 says, "If the dead do not rise, then go ahead, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." What that means is, if there is no God, there is no resurrection, and there is no judgment to come. So live it up. That was Belshazzar's attitude. And it makes sense. Of course it does. If there is no God, then let's party. But if there is a God, it makes no sense at all. History tells us that he was about to find out the reason he should not have been partying it up that night. And the Bible lets us know that he was about to come face to face with the one God that he had tried to ignore, the one God that he had overlooked and tried to put down to the level of his gods. Belshazzar was about to learn a new lesson about life and death that night. History tells us that as they partied, the Medo-Persians were just waiting outside their gates, set to enter. But the king didn't care. He thought everything was safe, that he'd made plenty of preparations, and nothing could spoil his party. Well, verses 5 through 9 tell us about something that happened that did spoil the party. A strange thing happened. While they were in the midst of partying, a hand appeared. Not the whole body, just part of the arm and a hand, and started writing on the wall. There they were defiling God's sacred articles, and this happened. Nebuchadnezzar probably thought there could possibly maybe be some connection, but at that time he was too scared to really think it through. He was so scared, it said his knees started knocking and his body started shaking. Have you ever been in such shock or so scared that your body literally started to shake? If so, maybe you have just a little bit of glimpse of the terror that Belshazzar was going through at that moment. God accomplished through a hand writing on the wall what all the armies of the Mede-Persian Empire were unable to do. While the king could not understand the meaning, he knew this ain't good. He knew something had to be wrong. And obviously he had learned nothing from his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. And so he turns to what? The enchanters, the astrologers, and the soothsayers. But you know what? They proved to be just as useless to him as they had been to Nebuchadnezzar when he had called them. So we come to another disciple lesson. They call the righteous in times of trouble. If you're a believer, get ready. You will get called someday. And verses 10 through 12 of chapter 5, the king could see the writing on the wall, and he was fearful, but he didn't understand what it meant or what he was supposed to do about it. He needed a Daniel who could not only see the writing, but interpret it. Well, no one was able to help but the queen. The queen, in a moment of crisis, remembered the one who could help. And she said, "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. Let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." She remembered, or she had heard, how Nebuchadnezzar had Daniel interpret his dreams. And she knew that the only reason Daniel could do it was because the Spirit of God lived within him. And our next lesson is, they will never forget your roots. In verse 13 and 14, Daniel was brought before the king, and the king spoke to him and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who was one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." Okay. Before he tells Daniel who he is and that he's heard about God being within him, he starts with, "Oh yeah, you're one of those captives." Now here's Daniel. He's an old man now. And it still is remembered, even though he has risen to a place of authority in the kingdom, that he was a captive, that he was from the other side of the tracks. He was from Jerusalem. And you came here like that. And he says, "Yeah, I've heard about you. I've heard about you. I know who you are." You see, even though the Spirit of God may be resting in you, and even though God has given you gifts to help people, those in the greatest need of help will often try to bring you down to their level, so that the help that you give will not seem to come from God himself, but will seem to come from one who is down on their level. Daniel hadn't been consulted in a long time. Well, at least not during the reign of this king. Yet, when real trouble came, he was the one that they sought after. And then the king makes a promise. He said, "Now if you can read the writing and make known to me the interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Belshazzar offers to make Daniel the third ruler because his father is out of the country at the time, and he's the first king. And, of course, Belshazzar's number 2. That would make Daniel third. Daniel says, "I don't need your gifts. I don't want your gifts. But yes, I will give you the interpretation." And so in verses 18 through 21, Daniel gives a history lesson of Nebuchadnezzar. He wants Belshazzar to understand the reason why all of this is coming about. And he wants him to understand what has happened. The problem is, as the German philosopher Hegel says, history teaches that man learns nothing from history. That's sad but true, and especially in the case of Belshazzar here. He had learned nothing from the history of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. And so Daniel continues building his case so that he can present the judgment and then the verdict, so that everyone will understand that why that writing was given at that particular time. And Daniel interprets the writing, and in verses 21 through 23, he tells the king he's going to be removed. You saw how God humbled your grandfather, and yet you wouldn't humble yourself. You were given great revelation from God, but you rejected every bit of it. You mocked the true God. Daniel speaks straight to the king's actions. The one being mocked and declared irrelevant in the kingdom was the very one and the only one who held the king's very life and breath in his hands. Then Daniel goes on to get to the point, and the interpretation, mene, tekel, shapharli, that really was confusing. I mean, they were just 4 little words, but it caused great confusion because these Aramaic words each had more than one meaning. Mene means number or mina, a unit of money. Tekel means weighed or shekelled, or a unit of money. Farsin means divided, or Persia, or half a shekel. It's just like maybe you've had a dream, and you wake up and you can remember exactly what the dream means. Maybe you were dreaming that you were in a car and you were driving down a highway, and you came to a divided highway, and you were sitting there trying to decide what road to take, and you woke up. Well, you knew what the car was, you knew what the road was, you knew what the divided highway meant, but what it all personally meant to you, you had no idea. And that's the way it was here with Belshazzar and all of his Chaldean friends. They saw it, but they didn't know what it meant. I mean, there were several interpretations open at the best. It could have meant money, 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 we're going to get rich. But they all felt that it probably meant something much more foreboding. So Daniel gives the interpretation. What it means is numbered, weighed, and divided. As the king starts to hear this, he becomes more and more anxious and fearful. Daniel says, your number's up, Belshazzar. You have been weighed and found spiritually weightless. Your life and kingdom are over. You have been found wanting. You see, God not only numbers our days, but he weighs our life. And he records and judges all the deeds that we make. The Bible tells us that it is appointed unto man once to die, and then comes the judgment. For believers, we don't have to worry. This is not a judgment of our sin and condemnation. Jesus took all that on the cross. But what it is, it's a judgment of our lives and how we lived and what we did. And it's a judgment that only what we have done for Christ will survive that. And that's what Daniel was telling him. He said, your number's up. Your days are over. Your kingdom is going to end. Belshazzar says, okay. He doesn't believe it. What does he do? And verse 29, he rewards Daniel for telling him that his kingdom's at an end and that he's going to be removed by making him third in the kingdom. Can't you see Daniel rolling his eyes, shaking his head, saying, Belshazzar, you don't get it. You don't have a kingdom. You know, if the king had repented at that very moment, he could have been saved. But Belshazzar didn't. And that very night, in the midst of the partying, the walls that Belshazzar thought no one could go through were penetrated, and Belshazzar died. Darius the Mede took over the kingdom and became king. And Darius doesn't know Daniel the way Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar did, but we see by verse 2, Daniel, because of God's favor upon him, has been promoted again. Why? Because Daniel lived a life of humility. Pride, it'll tear down any king, tear down any kingdom. But it says, humble yourselves in the sight of God and he will raise you up. That's what happened to Daniel. And that's what can happen to you. If you're going through some hard times, don't think that you can make it by yourself. Don't try to prove how strong you are, that you don't need anyone's help. Admit you need God's help, and he will help you through it. Just like he did Nebuchadnezzar. Don't be a Belshazzar. He says, I don't need anybody. I'm going to live for today. Recognize God is at work on your behalf. And he wants to change your life, to give you grace, and to give you hope.